Hi, and welcome to the Serial Killers podcast. It's a podcast all about the pests, diseases and problems that affect arable crops. Each week we're going to do a deep dive into one of those particular problems. Hi Josie.
Hello.
So today's serial killer is rust. Rust affects a lot of different cereal crops and there are a number of different species that we need to look at. So what do we know about rust, Josie?
Right, okay, really interesting pathogen here. It's an obligate fungal parasite.
So that means it can't live outside of the plant.
It can't. There's approximately 8,000 named species. Many of them are host specific. So a plant will have its own rust pathogen.
There's virtually one for every plant that you could actually make money from.
That's right. Of these 8,000 named species, apparently there's many more types not yet discovered in tropical, subtropical regions. So that number could be far higher.
Yeah, there could be one growing on an obscure weed in your hedgerow that has never been actually discovered because it doesn't infect an economically important crop. And it just goes by the wayside.
They think, biologists think that rust fungi are very ancient fungi and they've had the opportunity to co-evolve with so many plants.
So the interest in rust started in the 18th century in Italy. And in fact, their scientific name is named after an Italian scientist, Tommaso Puccinia. Am I saying that correctly, Josie? If you're of Italian heritage, aren't you?
I am.
Yeah, you say it, go on. Tommaso Puccinia. So there are the ones that affect cereal crops are all in the Puccinia genus, but there is a much wider family, and that's where the 2,000 species?
8,000.
8,000 species.
Named species.
Wow, 8,000 named species. So we've got rusts can get very complicated very quickly. I guess when you were doing your research, you didn't get confused, but I did get confused. And I've broken it down.
It comes in lots of different colours, shapes, sizes, and it affects all different parts of the plants depending on the actual type of rust.
Yeah. So for arable crops, I've broken it down to these 7 rusts that should be of interest. We've got brown rust, also known as leaf rust, and that's Puccinia triticini. And that affects wheats, but there's also different variants of that affect barley, rye, but not oats. So of brown rust, the brown rust that affects wheat won't affect rye, and again, the one that affects rye won't affect barley. Brown rust, despite its name, is more orange, and it's a late summer disease. So that because it's a late summer disease, it's of low to medium risk for arable farmers in the UK because you're close to harvest by the time it starts to really become a problem. We've got black rust, also known as Puccinia graminis or stem rust, and that's widespread throughout the globe.
That's the rust that affects wheat, isn't it? Puccinia
It affects wheat,
graminis,
but it's not as much of a problem in the UK, and I think that's because it's cold in the winter. And so, although geographically important for the UK, that's not so much a problem. And yellow rust, that's the main one that we're interested in. That's Puccinia striformis, and that's important because it's seriously a problem in the UK, especially in the east, and it strikes early. And if it strikes early, that means it can develop throughout the crop and become an issue. Okay, and then I've got 4 other types of rust which I'll quickly go through and then won't mention again. Crown rust, which affects oats only, and hence its scientific name, coronata, crown. And that's, again, it's a late season rust in oats, so it's not as devastating as yellow rust. In oilseed rape, we've got white rust, which is not a rust at all. It's more like a mold. It's not even a true fungus. So we can ignore oilseed white rust for another time. And then in maize, this is where it gets stupid. You get Puccinia sorghum, right? Which you think, oh, sorghum, it must infect maize and sorghum. No, Puccinia sorghum only affects maize. And Puccinia purpurea, that's the one that affects sorghum. And usually scientific names change when they're incorrect. But that one, that sorghum, the fact that it doesn't affect sorghum, for some reason, no one's bothered to change the name. So
Okay, watch this space. Now that we've highlighted it, it might come up with a
yeah.
change.
Interestingly, though, scientific names only change when there's a confusion. And so there's a beetle that lives in the Balkans, and it's named after Hitler. And
That's a bit unfortunate.
scientists refuse to change its name because there's no scientific reason to change its name, only a political reason.
Well, that's you could debate that.
Yeah, you think, it's not very woke, is it?
No.
No. So
Rust fungus, as you said, really interesting as you can't replicate it in a petri dish.
no, something like mildew you can. Mildew you can grow very easily, but rust you can't.
You can't. So finding a cure for that is very difficult because you can't grow it in a lab.
Yeah. Like mildew, though, it's something called a biotrophic fungus, and that means that it's basically tricking the plants into thinking it's not there. It goes into stealth mode. But it gets the plant to feed itself, as opposed to something like let's think like Phytophthora or Fusarium, which just goes in there, kills the plant, and eats its innards out of it.
Rust doesn't actually kill plants; it just limits the growth and production of food. So obviously, it will affect photosynthesis because obviously leaves won't be green. So plants will become very sickly, but they don't actually die as such.
No, the rust wants to keep it alive, just like a slave, really, to it. So that's an issue. And then it's got a very unusual life cycle, rust, unlike any other pathogen that will affect an arable crop, and that's because it's heteroecious. And Josie, you've done a lot of research on this, so
yeah,
I'll let you lead.
It starts off on a different host.
Yep.
And then it is insects will mediate that. Right.
So they transfer the spores.
And then it will turn into acium, which produce aciospores.
Right.
And then these are spread long distance by erodospores from continental Europe, even.
Oh, right. So it can come all the way from continental Europe. Yeah, so these iridiospores, they are what grow on the wheat, and it's a bit like if you've seen the film Alien, where the alien escapes from Sigourney. Is it Sigourney Weaver? No, it's one of the spacemen.
Doesn't she?
Yeah, out of his stomach and bursts out. If you look at rust under a microscope, it like bursts out of the leaf surface and these spores are released. It's pretty gruesome under a microscope.
Yeah.
And there's those spores.
And that will then go into wheat. Then it will overwinter as teleospores on the stubble.
These are the black spores. So you'll notice this rust gets darker as it goes along, and these dark spores sit in the leaf surface, in the leaf litter, and then they germinate and hatch and are released in the spring. And
these basidiospores will then infect the barberry again, the stems and leaves, and then the barberry again will reinfect the wheat.
Have we mentioned barberry yet?
Yeah.
So barberry is the alternate host for rust.
Yeah.
And barberry is a plant, it's a shrub, isn't it, in the buttercup family. And I think that is somewhere where the US...
They have huge issues with that.
In America they imported both wheat and barberry at the same time and didn't realise that they were alternate hosts for the same pathogen.
That's right.
But I don't think barberry is grown widely in the UK, so I think the alternate host is probably something else in the buttercup family, another weed. I don't come across barberry on my walks around the countryside, so I think that's it. Rust infects the wheat plant through the stomata, so it actually goes through the pores, the guard cells, and forms what we call a haustoria, like a clamp on the cells that feeds off it.
The hyphae from the fungus, the little hyphae will actually break through the plant cell wall, and then they create the haustorium. So it's attaching itself to those cells. And it's pretty amazing that the plant doesn't detect that and fight against it. It's a biochemical trickery. On the fungus's parts. So yield losses, do you have any figures for yield losses? I haven't got yield losses as such, not with in the agriculture industry, but in the hortic industry, it really does affect a lot of flowers and flowering plants and a lot of fruit plants, plums, blueberries. Blueberries are worth £32 million in the UK as an industry, but they do suffer from rust, and the plum industry is worth 8.6 million.
Ukraine is massive for blueberries. I once went to a show called Fruit Logistica in Germany, and all day it was just blueberry farmers from the Ukraine asking me questions. Eventually I just said, yeah, it works brilliantly on blueberries in Ukraine, because I knew they were all blueberry farmers. But yeah, in yellow rust can take 40% of the crop if you had no control and just let it go year on year. And then a later variety of rust, like the crown rust and oats, that's going to be 20%. So not as bad, but still worth controlling if it's effective. Various different rusts have different abilities to overwinter. So some, as we say, can survive in the leaf litter. And that really depends, really governs whether it can take hold in the UK. So,
well, the optimum conditions for rust infection are when temperatures are between 20 to 30 degrees Celsius.
Yeah.
And the foliage is wet. So with irrigation, it's best to irrigate in the early morning hours so that the plants can dry out over the day, but to definitely avoid overhead sprinklers and to use something like drip irrigation and soaker hoses instead.
Yeah, if you're a nursery.
Yeah, to keep those leaves dry. And soft leafy growth is most susceptible.
And I guess that's because the stomata are open, and so the spores their germination tube can get through the stomata, whereas if it was dry, then the stomata are partially closed or fully closed, and so that spore is never going to get through.
That's right.
And so if we're talking about a cold winter being things like the maize rust will never overwinter, and black rust won't overwinter in the UK. So, but with climate change, that could be a different thing.
Yeah.
So.
Also, a rapid increase in temperature and higher light will exacerbate the problem. But the leaf needs to be wet for 6 to 10 hours. And at the moment, with the weather that we're having, that's not difficult.
No. So we've had a very wet and hot year, haven't we? So it's perfect conditions for rust to take hold. We've seen a lot of interest in farmers coming to us looking for rust control this year. So that's been something to look at. Late sowing is an issue. Making sure you get rid of all the volunteers. So wheat from previous years you want to get rid of. One of the key issues that a number of farmers have spoken to us about is the removal of an active ingredient. So for some of the fungicides have been removed. One called CTL, chlorothalonil, has been removed, and people have come to us looking for alternatives, biofungicides.
Copper fungicide and sulfur fungicide seem to be something that were used to control it.
Yeah, it's a copper. Copper isn't. I don't like copper. I have a big bee in my bonnet about copper fungicides and mainly copper fertilizers. So people sell copper fertilizers, and no crop in the UK has ever been deficient in copper. So there's no need. It's a
micronutrient of a very small.
Yeah, and copper is highly toxic. It's a heavy metal. It's toxic to humans in very small amounts, and so you really want to be looking for alternatives to copper.
What about sulfur fungicide?
Sulfur's good, but it's acidic, so you can strip the plant of calcium, and so you can do more harm than good, especially if you're looking to produce strong cell walls. Taking calcium out of the cells is basically acid rain. We produce something called lime sulfur, which is an alkaline form of sulfur. It's very good at killing any fungal pathogen, but it also kills all the beneficials as well. So only use lime sulfur when it's a last resort, I would say, when your crop is on its knees. There are triazoles, strobilurins. These are semi-natural. Strobilurins are fungicides. Triazoles are fully synthetic. And as I say, Bayer, BASF, Syngenta, they're the guys to speak to when it comes to conventional synthetic fungicides. They're expensive. People are moving away, especially regen farmers. And it's something that we've looked at Eutrema intensively this year. So we've developed something called the Fungicide Reduction Action Plan, or FRAP, with our farming collaborators, and we'll be mailing that out to a lot of farms this year. And that's just talking about different products that can be used to make the plant healthier, more resistant, and then using bio-fungicides to control rust, mildew, septoria, alternaria.
So have you heard of Bacillus subtilis?
Bacillus subtilis, yeah. That's a biological control product, yeah. And it's registered for a number of products, and it's a bio-fungicide.
Yeah, that's approved for organic gardening.
Yep. So that would be something that would outcompete and also kill the rust, and it's non-toxic to humans.
You can treat and pick crops the same day.
Yes. So it's got a no pre-harvest interval.
No. Rust itself is not poisonous to humans, but if you do eat anything that's got rust on it, the food might taste off.
What would it taste like? Rusty?
Off.
Just off?
Off.
Yeah. It can infect the ears of cereal crops as well if it gets really bad. One of the other biological control methods I thought about was yellow ladybirds. Have you ever come across yellow ladybirds?
No.
So in Australia, they have these yellow ladybirds that eat spores off these surfaces. So for mildew, they actually eat powdery mildew and things like that. You can't actually buy them in the UK, but you can actually buy them as a biocontrol agent in Australia. I think because they're native there.
This year, though, there has been a distinct lack of buzzy insects and any kind of flying insects, I've found.
That's I thought you were going to mention a study then, and then
no,
just something Josie has found.
No, I have personally found a distinct lack of buzzy insects.
Yeah, on your car windscreen.
Yes.
Yeah. How are you going to identify rust? I guess it looks rusty.
It normally occurs from the ground up.
Yep.
And it's usually on the underside of leaves.
Yep.
It actually can cause other symptoms like witch's broom.
Yes.
Cankers.
Yeah, I think that's on non-arable crops though.
Okay. Oozes.
Yeah.
And on conifers.
It's really nasty on conifers.
Yeah, the needles will be affected by it and the bark.
Yeah.
As well. Basically, if you've got premature leaf fall, stunted growth, off colour, weak plants.
I think one of the things you'll see on Twitter when farmers are looking at rust is they push the whole plant down to get right down, because that's where the rust is going to develop first, right at the base.
Yeah.
Because you need virtually 100% humidity for it to take hold, and so at the top of the plant is not where you're going to see it. As I say, for organic control, at Eutrema we make a product called CHITOSAN, and that's a biofungicide that is authorised for use on cereals against rust. And what it does, it attaches to the lesions, dries them out and seals them so spores can't be released. But one of the key things that CHITOSAN does is that because it contains the same chemical that rust is made of, chitin, the plant detects that it's under attack by a pathogen. Now, normally rust is able to become this stealth parasite because it's turned off the chitin receptors. But when you go in there and spray CHITOSAN, it turns all these receptors back on. And so we've seen amazing results on rust.
Great.
We've seen farmers say that it's unbelievable, the effects on yellow rust over in the east, in Yorkshire, Humberside, Northumberland. And so we definitely recommend trialling that. We also recommend applying sea silica, which is our organic silicon product, alongside to make the cell wall stronger. And then we also have salicylic acid, which is another elicitor of plant defences that acts systemically, and it can be used as a root drench. So there are a number of options when it comes to controlling it. Also things like mycorrhiza. A lot of farmers wouldn't have necessarily used mycorrhiza, beneficial fungi, in the past, but the move to regenerative farming and no-till makes sense because you're not ploughing up that mycorrhiza that you've invested in each year. So mycorrhiza will make plants more resilient, maybe not to rust, but but things like take-all and stuff like that is definitely a good angle. So say CHITOSAN's good. You can literally see the lesion dry up after 12 to 24 hours.
Oh, that's good. So
that's good. Just going back to the barberry, did you know there was a war against barberries in America? Did you hear about this? So in the 1920s, they just decided they were going to kill all the barberry in the Corn Belt and places like that, and they just everyone took part, and it was a big in all the newspapers and everyone, and they wiped it out from massive regions. And I just think to do that now, you just get loads of people going, well, you're not taking my barberries out my
No,
garden.
you'd get Save the Barberry campaign.
I know you would, yeah. And so, yeah, there are important...
People tying themselves to barberry plants.
You'd have, maybe the left and the right you'd have the hippies and the MAGA people uniting in saving these plants. But yeah, at the detriment to the farmers maybe. So we said climate change is going to be an issue, especially with warmer winters.
We're seeing that, warmer winters, and it's been very wet as well. But a lot of plants are suffering with this climate change. Roses, particularly, having spoken to a big producer of roses, they're not actually sure what direction they're going to go in because they've had to withdraw a lot of roses for sale because they cannot survive with the climatic conditions we've got in this country.
I guess black spot as well is going to be this one. So.
Horrendous.
Yeah, so when we look at rust in other countries, it's a massive issue in South Africa, Syria. It's thought that the rust outbreak in Syria contributed to the civil war and the sharp rise in food prices.
Absolutely.
So one of many examples of where a plant disease has led to political change. You can link political change in India to the price of onions, the Irish potato famine, or just the famine, is linked to potato blight, as is the defeat of the Germans in World War One. So
many famines have been caused by fungi.
But even governments change when crops are destroyed. So rust has that ability; it can be that bad.
It can also affect grasses, literally like your lawn. When you're walking along it, your shoes will get full of this yellow powdery stuff.
And I think as well, rust in America on lawns can actually be health problems because of the amount of spores that are released. Luckily, those won't be affecting wheat or barley, things like that. But the same climatic conditions will be affecting them. So, as we say, rust is an unusual pathogen in that it's heterogeneous. It needs an alternate host. It can't be grown outside. The yield losses can be remarkably high, 40% for stem rust if you get it early on. Luckily, farmers that we've been using with the CHITOSAN have seen really good results. Combine that with silica and in a treatment program, and you can remove a lot of the synthetic fungicides. So definitely something to look into if you're a farmer who's looking to control rust on your farm.
Yeah, it's really big in the horticultural industry with flowers and floriculture.
Yep.
Too.
Brilliant. So, any final thoughts on rust, Josie, before we leave them?
Interestingly, hot water you can use hot water as a control because rust only exists in a narrow temperature band. Yeah. So if you use hot water, it will kill it. However, I'm not sure it will do your plant many favours, but it will kill that pathogen.
That is... Someone out there is going to think of a way of utilising that.
That hot water.
Yeah. Well, steam is often used as a soil sterilant in strawberry crops, so it'd be interesting to know.
Well, it will live on, because you have to check the ground level. So obviously, some sort of hot treatment or something might.
Do you know what, Josie? You're going to be responsible for farmers. Just you can see these steam. What's that farmer doing? Is he setting fire to his crop? No, he's using the Josie method of steaming his wheat.
Yes.
Or her wheat, sorry. Yeah. So, brilliant.
Hot water.
Brilliant. So that was rust, our serial killer for this week. Next week we'll be covering thrips, hopefully.
Thrips, lovely.
They are.
I'm just itching at the thought of that.
Yeah, thunder
not
flies.
In a good way.
Yeah, thunder flies, not thunder flies. Brilliant. All right. Till next week. Thank you very much.
Take care.